What's the cost of living in Mexico? Find out in this Expats in Mexico interview with Tim Leffel. He's the author of A Better Life for Half the Price. Hey, Tim, how does Mexico stack up against other countries in the world for cost of living?
Well, it's not the absolute cheapest on earth just because Mexico is not the poorest country on earth, which is a good thing. I mean, you can go to some other places in Latin America where your costs might be a bit lower, such as maybe Nicaragua or Guatemala, even Ecuador in some spots. Or you could go over to Cambodia or India or somewhere like that. So it's not the absolute cheapest, but I think it's pretty easy for most people to cut their expenses in half just by crossing our southern border and moving to Mexico. So there's definitely a lot of appeal there. Plus, you can get there pretty easily from the U.S. and Canada. There's incredible air connections, and you don't actually have to spend a lot more than you would to fly within those countries a lot of times.
Well, considering there are a million expats living in Mexico and about three-quarters of them are from the U.S., I would say it's probably a good place to live, huh?
Yeah, for sure. And that was part of my decision when I moved there with my family too. And I'd had a little vacation home there that we went to now and then, but when we were looking to move abroad, we were actually looking at some other countries in Latin America and decided in the end, besides the food and the culture and all the other good reasons to go, it was just a whole lot more convenient than most of the other choices we had.
And you lived in Guanajuato, right?
Yes, and I still have a house there and I will return there. But right now my daughter is finishing up high school. She's in her senior year, and it made a whole lot of sense to come back for a while so she could get a U.S. diploma, and then we would skedaddle again once she got into college.
Well, it's a great place to live. I love Guanajuato. So
Yeah.
why is Mexico such a great value?
Well, part of that just is kind of the natural order of the world in terms of economics. If the labor costs are lower and taxes are lower, then the cost of living just tends to be lower. And you can even see that within a country such as the United States. If you live in New York City or San Francisco, you are very aware of the pain of housing costs and labor costs in those places. But if you go to Ames, Iowa, or North Dakota, it's a whole different story, and that plays out across the globe. And just the labor costs are much lower in Mexico than they are in the United States, which is why there are a lot of car factories there and other things like that. But also that just plays out across everything, whether it's renting a house or getting a haircut or getting your pants hemmed or whatever. You're just going to spend a whole lot less than you would in the United States.
What places in Mexico are easiest on the pocketbook?
Yeah, that's a good question because I don't think people realize how much of a difference there is from place to place in Mexico. And if you go to live in Cabo San Lucas, you're probably not going to see much of a savings because it can be just as much as it is to live in California. I mean, maybe a little better value on what you get in your housing dollar, but it's still going to be pretty expensive when you go out to eat. And so I think if you go to the places that you've heard of, that all the tourists have gone to for decades, then you're not going to get as nearly as much of a savings as you would if you go to the interior. And even within the interior, I think you'll pay a little more in the favorite expat spots, which would be San Miguel de Allende and Lake Chapala probably, because those places, the secret's been out for 2 decades and they only tend to get more expensive, not less, because everyone tells their friends about it and their friends come live there, and the numbers keep going up. So not that there's anything wrong with living in those places. There's a built-in social structure and good food and good shopping, and so there's a lot of reasons to live there. But I think if you go to sort of a secondary city, whether that's Guanajuato or Querétaro or Zacatecas or even Oaxaca, you're going to spend a whole lot less just because there are not so many millionaires as your neighbors.
Well, what do you think are the top three places for people considering moving to Mexico that they'd get the most bang for their buck?
Yeah, I don't want to encourage lots of people to come to Guanajuato because then my fellow residents are going to be angry with me because they like it just the way it is. But that's the way it goes with these things. But it is a good spot, and actually Lake Chapala is a perfectly fine spot if people want to sort of ease into things in Mexico because you can get a house with a garage there. You can, have a decent amount of space, and it's still pretty quiet there. It's not, too crazy. I like San Cristobal de las Casas a lot in Chiapas. I could definitely live there. And Oaxaca, despite all its problems, still has a lot going for it. It's a great handicraft center. It's the Mezcal Center. It's got a beautiful historic center, a lot of great music. And so I do like it there a lot, but it kind of depends on what you're up for. I've got friends living in Mexico City who love it there. And so if you're a city person and you want to live in a big capital that's, where there's a great art scene and music scene and the best restaurants, then maybe that's your place.
Well, it's all about value and perception, isn't it? So when people make that final decision to move to Mexico, climate, lifestyle, the geographic characteristics of the place they go to, the nightlife, all of those things enter into the decision. But and cost of living obviously is a major factor. But for people who are interested primarily in a nice place that has a very, very good cost of living, then it sounds like the places that you just mentioned would be tops on your list.
Yeah, it depends on how much of a pioneer you are too. I mean, if you speak Spanish well and have traveled a lot in your life, then you're going to be a lot happier in a place where there are maybe only 100 other foreigners than someone who has not spent much time outside the country. So there is some comfort in moving to a place like San Miguel de Allende where you've got such a built-in social structure. I mean, you can find a chess club, a meditation club, a tennis club, go play racquetball, whatever you want. And you don't get those things in a lot of other cities that don't have that infrastructure.
That's right. Does it make a difference where you're moving from in terms of setting your expectations for living in Mexico? I know living in California, people who move, and there are quite a few Californians and living as expats in Mexico. It's so expensive to live in California that Mexico is definitely a real bargain. But if you're moving from, say, Ohio or North Carolina or someplace like that, are you going to find a much larger differentiation, or is it going to be pretty much the same as back home?
Yeah, definitely. And I point that out a lot. I mean, I'm going to use this opportunity to plug this because my book is called A Better Life for Half the Price. And I do get some flack about that sometimes where people say, well, I moved from farm country to Buenos Aires and I didn't get that much of a benefit. Yeah, well, that's, rural to urban. So you kind of have to compare apples to apples. I mean, if you're coming from New York City and moving to Mexico City, you're going to think it's the greatest bargain on earth. But if you're moving there from some, small town with one stoplight, then it might not seem like such a bargain. So you do have to keep that in mind. And if you're moving from a resort area to a resort area, that's a pretty fair comparison too. So if you're going from Miami to Cancun or Puerto Vallarta, then it's probably not going to seem very expensive. You could live there for half price. But if you're coming from a landlocked area like Arkansas and you're moving to Puerto Vallarta, it's not probably going to seem such a deal. So you got to keep those factors in mind. But even having said all that, you will definitely still find it cheaper to go out to eat, to get a maid, to take the bus somewhere, to take a taxi. So there are a lot of costs that are universally less in Mexico that you will definitely feel no matter where you're coming from in the U.S. or Canada. But of course, if you're from a high-priced state or high-priced city, then that opens up your options considerably. I think if you're moving from San Francisco, you can go pretty much anywhere in Mexico and know that you're going to live for less than half price.
How much of a factor is the lifestyle you want to live in Mexico?
It's a big factor. I think if you try to live the exact same life you had in the U.S., then you're going to spend more than someone who's willing to adapt a bit. And I think this is the thing that people struggle with the most, who are not saving a lot of money. When you really break down what they're spending it on, you find out they're buying a lot of imported goods in the supermarket that are not any cheaper. Those things are going to be actually more expensive. They're buying a lot of electronics, maybe. They're trying to go shop for clothing. And they're trying to have a house that's exactly like the one they left in the United States, which is costly because if you want if you want Viking appliances and Sub-Zero refrigerators and a dishwasher and all those things in a 3-car garage, then yes, you're going to spend a lot of money. Whereas if you live in a house that's on a street that's pedestrian only and you don't have a car, then you're going to save a fortune. And, I think it's all in the attitude that you come into it with. A lot of people want to live a Mexican life when they move to Mexico. A lot of people want to live a U.S. life just in a different place. So that can definitely affect how much you spend on everything in your month-to-month bills, and the air conditioning side of things too. If you live in a place like Guanajuato or San Miguel or Zacatecas, you're living at a pretty high altitude, so you don't have much heat, you don't have much air conditioning. But if you're moving to someplace like Los Cabos, then that's like living in Phoenix. You know, you're going to have the air conditioning running all the time, and as you probably know, the electricity costs in Mexico are progressive. Basically, the more you use, the more you pay per kilowatt hour. So that could affect things as well.
I know. Well, living in Puerto Vallarta, as I did, is extremely expensive for electricity there. I can recall paying over $700 for 2 months for a my electricity bill during the summer. So it's something to consider when you're thinking about living in the resort areas or the lower coastal areas in Mexico.
Yeah.
So, Tim, what is the number one cost saving for expats in Mexico? Would it be homes?
Yeah, I think real estate's usually the biggest one just because that's where people are spending the bulk of their paycheck, you know, anywhere they're living. I mean, in the US, that can be easily 25-30% of your income is going to housing. And if you just, you know, rent a regular run-of-the-mill two-bedroom house in Mexico or apartment, it's pretty easy to get one for $500, $600, $700 a month, which is pretty tough in most of the U.S. these days. And then the other one, though, for a lot of people, it might not be housing, it might be healthcare. Because if you're self-employed in the United States, you're spending easily 20% of your income on healthcare. And with the, I don't want to go into politics, but with all the uncertainty happening right now with the Affordable Care Act, some people are getting bills that are literally 40 or 50% more than what they were paying last year because of the subsidy uncertainties. So that could be a huge factor. If you're employed by a big company in the U.S., then things are pretty good. You know, you're getting your insurance through your employer and no problem. But if you're self-employed or you're working for Walmart or whatever, and you're not old enough to be getting Medicare, then you are probably paying a significant portion of your income to healthcare, and those costs can go down drastically in Mexico, even if you just pay everything out of pocket and don't have any, you know, kind of monthly healthcare plan. You could just pay everything out of pocket and have a hip surgery thrown in there and probably spend less than you would in the States.
Are there any other top cost savings besides homes and healthcare?
Well, going out to eat and going out for entertainment are definitely a whole lot cheaper. I in Guanajuato, I go out to the symphony at $6. If we go see a performance at the Teatro Juarez, which is this beautiful theater from 1920, it's usually either 50 pesos or 100 pesos. And these days, with the exchange rate where it is, that's, you know, $3 to $6. And that's for, you know, some touring jazz act or for some dance performance. And so we go out all the time there and don't even think twice about it. We also eat out a lot more, especially the big meal of the day. In the middle of the day, it's pretty easy to find a pretty good meal for $6 or $8, sometimes less if you go to a marketplace. So those are big differences that I think almost anybody is going to notice. And then just you just have the opportunity to upgrade your life because of the cost of labor being cheaper. You can have a private tutor, you can have a maid, you can have a gardener. None of those things are cost prohibitive, and so it just can make a difference in what you actually have to physically do every day or every week in your life. And my daughter actually took a taxi to school every day. That's how cheap it was. Can you imagine trying to do that in a big city in the U.S.? But it was $3, so why not?
And Uber and Lyft are in most of the major cities in Mexico now, too. Did you own an automobile when you lived in Guanajuato?
I did not, and I don't know if I ever will, honestly, because it was really not necessary where we lived. And, you know, like I said, my daughter took a taxi to school, and then she would take a bus home, and you can walk most of that city, and a lot of them are like that. The only time we really missed it is when we wanted to go to Leon to go to shopping at Costco or something like that. And luckily we had friends who had a car and they would just let us know if they were going. There were times where we rented a car to go out of the city to go on vacation. And it was pretty much the same price as the U.S. to rent a car. So that was not a big expense to do that. So if we added it up each month, even if we took a lot of taxis and took a rental car now and then, or took a bus out of town, it was still less than it would be to maintain a vehicle, especially with parking.
Well, even though they don't really have a passenger train service to any great extent in Mexico, the first class buses are a fantastic deal.
Yeah, they're very comfortable. They have Wi-Fi. The executive level has 3 seats across with lots of leg room. So, yeah, we took those all over the place.
And they're very inexpensive.
Yeah, I think so. And like again, if you live in Ajijic and Lake Chapala, it's pretty easy to have a car. A lot of the houses have a place to driveway or garage, but most of colonial Mexico, that's not the case. Parking is definitely at a premium.
Can you be happy in Mexico living on less money?
For sure. I know plenty of people that are living on the equivalent of a Social Security check, which is, $1,200, $1,300 a month, and they're living quite well. I mean, they're not going crazy maybe, but they're definitely comfortable. And we as a family, the comparison I always make is we spend the same amount on rent in Tampa, Florida for a 3-bedroom place downtown in a good school district than we spent on everything in Mexico. So our monthly budget was $2,100 a month. Now that didn't include when we went on vacation and we flew to Puerto Escondido or something like that. But if we were just doing routine weekend trips, we included that as well. So, that's for housing costs, for food, for going out, for everything.
Can you give some money saving tips for people who are thinking about moving to Mexico or living in Mexico and want to reduce their cost of living?
Sure, we'll try to live more like a local, first of all, and that doesn't mean you have to, act like you're making $400 a month, but it means eating where the locals eat, taking transportation the way they get around, and just, recognizing that if you want to get your imported American food, you're going to pay a little bit more. But if you eat Mexican food and you buy tequila and rum, things are pretty sweet. So, I think it's just a slight adjustment to your habits can make a huge difference. And this is more of a mental happiness thing than a money thing, but just being patient. Things take a while. Things don't happen as quickly as you expect them to do, too, and it's not the land of convenience. And so, if you're willing to just wait a little while, you can usually get a better price on things.
What kind of advice can you give to people who are thinking about moving to Mexico and are concerned about cost of living? What would be your final words of advice to them?
Well, I encourage everyone to sort of take a trial run. Don't do the House Hunters International thing where they make it look like you can go somewhere for a weekend and pick out a new house and everything will be rosy. I don't think that's really reality anywhere. But it's good TV, so, more power to them. But I think if you go somewhere for a week or two and actually rent an apartment, an Airbnb kind of place in a neighborhood rather than living in the tourist zone where the hotels are, then that'll give you a good feel about what things really cost. You go shopping at the supermarket, you go to the local tienda, convenience store and buy, supplies. You go get a haircut, get your shoes shined, do all those kinds of things. And then while you're there, just take a look at where locals would go to find a place to live. And where I live in Guanajuato, there's a little paper called the Chopper, and that's what has all the local listings. And things are not generally online. People go to that little paper, or they just look around, or they ask their neighbors, and that'll give you a pretty accurate idea of what people are really spending on housing. So even if you don't speak Spanish, you can figure out what means 2 bedrooms and 6,000 pesos a month, and get out your calculator. So do all those things, and those things will tell you if you like the place, if you can really live with the downsides, what the pros and cons are. But it'll also give you a good idea of what prices are like. And then you can ask other expats while you're there that you run into in the coffee shop or the bar or whatever. Just ask them, what are you spending on electricity? What are you spending on your water bill? What's your gas bill like? And people usually aren't afraid to tell you those things. And if they've got a good deal on rent, they're really glad to tell you about that.
Hey, that's great advice, Tim. Thank you so much. You're truly the Mr. Cost of Living.
Try to keep tabs on it all. And right now, the peso's at 19 to the dollar as we speak, so things are quite a deal there right now.
Great. Thanks so much, Tim.